A very good afternoon. My name is Habib Mayar. I'm honored to be moderating this session today. But before that, I would like to share an anecdote, and then we will introduce the panel, the esteemed panel, and also the program flow. On 17th of October, the BBC published a heartbreaking story of a 2-year Somali boy named Abdiwali Abdi, who was struggling to cope with hunger in a 17-bed stabilization ward on the border of Somalia, outside a refugee camp. The parents brought this 2-year Somali boy from a refugee camp who was not able to even mourn because of lack of energy due to hunger. And this ward was supported by donor country. Like many other kids of his age, he was struggling to cope with the very basic nutrition. As the article explains, Abdiwali was only 2-year-old, and the stabilization ward was already overwhelmed with similar cases from kids from around Somalia, as the country is facing the worst drought in 40 years. There are similar facilities in Somalia outside in the outskirts of the remote areas, mainly which are constrained by lack of capacity and also controlled by the militant groups Al-Shabaab. Like others, the parents of the Abdiwali had been quite well off with 40 cows and a house near a town of Kansak's Dir, which is south of this town. But following the 5th failed season of rain, he decided to pack up a few belongings on a donkey cart and travel to the north of the country. Al-Shabaab militant tried to stop him, but then they settled the matter by confiscating his phone and smashing it in front of his eyes. The 2-year Abdiwali Abdi could not even mourn due to weakness. Despite the efforts to help him survive, the little boy dies in front of his parents' eyes. The article quotes what the head doctor mentioned, and I would like to start with, is it's so sad and painful when you witness something that can be prevented and can be corrected even easily. How can we prevent and correct the unprecedented hunger crisis caused by compounding impact of the natural disasters such as drought in the Horn of Africa, Middle East, floods in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and South Sudan, and elsewhere? With the inherent natural potential each country has gotten to feed its citizens, how can the current humanitarian development and peacemaking efforts work together to unleash that potential? With the hope to explore answer to these questions, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all to this official site event of COP27, Climate Resilient Food System and Peace, Exploring the Interconnections. As I mentioned, my name is Habib Mayar. I work at the G7+ Secretariat based in Delhi, Timor-Leste. Originally, I am from Afghanistan. The G7+ is an intergovernmental group of 20 conflict-affected countries that collectively advocate for peace and stability through national means and national dialogue and reconciliation. This event is co-organized by Fighting Food Crisis along with the HDP Nexus Coalition that I am proud to co-lead, the Climate Resilient Food System Alliance, and Switzerland. Against the background, increase in the world hunger since 2015, driven primarily by conflict and the impact of climate change, the HDP Nexus Coalition and the Climate Resilient Food System Alliance emerged through the UN conference, the UN Food System Summit, held in September 2021. The wide membership and engagement of various actors is the manifestation of recognition of the nexus between peace, development, and humanitarian action. With an esteemed line of high-level speakers, our event today comes at a critical time the world is facing a global hunger crisis of an unprecedented nature. These crises are disproportionately hurting people in countries that are already fragile due to decades of conflict and war. Extreme weather hazards induced by the climate change and the war in Ukraine are compounding what is already a year of unparalleled needs, unleashing a wave of collateral hunger that is spreading across the globe, transforming a series of terrible hunger emergencies into the global food crisis. The peril faced by the world's 828 million hungry people is expected to peak in 2022. And this is already a wake-up call for all of us. And therefore, we must work tirelessly to both save lives and build resilience in two fronts. One, save those whose lives are at risk while providing a foundation for commitment to meet their own food system. Keeping this in mind, today's event seeks to explore what Dr. Schreib, that from the anecdote mentioned, and I just shared, if we can prevent and correct the crisis of hunger that took the life of the 2-year Somali Abdi Wali Abdi and millions of other children around the world and elsewhere. We will seek to hear different perspectives on interlinkages between climate change, food insecurity, and conflicts, and explore the solutions to address the current climate and food crisis and prevent it from deteriorating further. Without further ado, I would like to invite Ms. Brigitte Menzi, Head of the Energy and Health, Environment and Health of Switzerland, to open this session with her remarks. Ms. Brigitte, the podium is yours. You can come to the podium, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon and to welcome you also on behalf of Switzerland. Unfortunately, our head of delegation is busy in negotiations, and that's why I'm speaking on his behalf today. I would also like the organizers to organize this event and for their work, and to the speakers, of course, for sharing their insights and experiences with us. The world faces many different and complex crises today. Climate change, environmental degradation, rising food and energy prices are compounding a darkening security horizon with an increasing number of armed conflicts. This creates new and more complex risks. It is particularly obvious when we look at how food systems are overwhelmed by these compounding effects. In the past few months, a worrying number of people have had to skip meals and to choose less nutritious food. Chronic malnutrition affects poverty and income in distribution, threatening development outcomes for decades to come. The Ukraine crisis, coming on top of COVID, increases pressure on fragile commodity supply chains and food prices. Extreme weather events such as droughts and floods threaten food production and livelihoods. This contributes to conflict or forced migration. The impacts of all these interlinked risks and crises are devastating. 345 million people, that's really a lot, in more than 80 countries experience acute food insecurity, according to the June 2022 WFP Global Operational Response Plan. And we expect the numbers to rise even more. In extreme cases, it leads to the humanitarian crisis we are witnessing in the Horn of Africa. Due to the droughts in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia, at least 16 million people faced high levels of acute food insecurity this year in June 2022. Those suffering the most from the adverse effects of climate change are often those least equipped to address them. On the contrary, they face a high risk of grievances, tensions, and conflicts, and need even more protection than others. The current global response is inadequate. Governments and the private sector are failing to address all the complexity of these intertwined crises. And with every day of inaction, we worsen tomorrow's security challenges and the situation of people in need. We must address these crises together in order to achieve and maintain peace and environmental integrity. Cooperation is the new realism. When risks cross borders, so must the solutions. Governments will have to cooperate for us all to survive and thrive. Our common food future is at stake. Switzerland is convinced that a nexus approach combining humanitarian, development, climate, and peace perspectives and insights is the way to go. We are committed to increased and effective coordination and collaboration among all relevant agencies and UN organizations. Switzerland will contribute to a better understanding of the link between food security, climate change, environmental degradation, and conflicts, including during its tenure as an elected member of the UN Security Council from 2023 to 2024. In the current circumstances, disaster relief and other short-term measures are essential. But we must also pursue medium and long-term solutions to solve the food crisis. Switzerland is committed to the right to adequate food for all. The issues of food security, nutrition, and capacity building are and will remain central pillars of our international cooperation and efforts. We need to accelerate the food systems transformation towards more sustainability, locality, equity, and resilience in line with the climate goals. This must apply to every step of the food system, from production to consumption, and include all elements that influence systems such as governments, policy, and finance. One of the approaches that Switzerland promotes in this regard is agroecology. Agroecology tackles climate change, food insecurity, and malnutrition. It redesigns food systems by adapting and diversifying farming systems and diets. It further improves soil management, innovation and knowledge exchange, inclusion and empowerment of the most vulnerable. Ladies and gentlemen, ending hunger is one of the main objectives of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We are currently failing to achieve this goal. More than ever, it is important to think about how we can build food systems that are climate and conflict resilient. The panel today will discuss how to best move this agenda forward. The COP must deliver its objectives in 3 pillars: mitigation, adaptation, and climate finance. This will reduce climate risks in general and more specifically also the impact of climate change on food security. We hope for a successful conclusion of the COP next week, and as such, I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion now. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
When risks can cross borders, so can solutions. Thank you so much, Ms. Menzies, for this insightful opening. And we also would like to thank Switzerland for playing a leadership role in promoting the nexus and among climate change, food security, and peace. With that, I would like now to invite Mr. Martin Croft, Global Director of the Resilient Agri-Food System area at CGIAR, who is an active partner in our HDP Nexus Coalition. He will offer an overview of the evidences of the interlinkages in the nexus. So the floor is yours, Mr. Martin.
Thank you very much, Chair, and welcome everybody. And it's an honor. Thanks for the invite, because of course it's very important that we have scientific evidence what's going on, but still we have to keep on focusing on solutions. I'm Martin Kropf, I'm Managing Director for Resilient Agri-Food Systems in the CGIAR, the international agri-food research organization. And we are based in 90 countries, mainly in developing countries. And many of our scientists are studying, also making the analysis, what is actually going on? What is the reason for what's happening in that sense? So I think That's why the linkage between climate security and food systems is important, and especially in relation to peace. I was for 6 years DG, or Director General of CIMMYT, the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, a part of our system, and of course founded by Norman Borlaug, who got the Nobel Prize for Peace, because in those days, 60 years ago, it was already clear that peace and agri-food, food security are connected very strongly. But the solutions now are different than 60 years ago. So what are the facts? And I worked with our scientists from the different centers of the CG just to get the facts together, because they are studying them in detail. Especially David Laborde, who is sitting over there, and Gracia Pasillo, who is sitting over there. Thank you for supporting in that sense. And I will end up with some ideas about how we could move on further. But these are the data. And it's not about the details, but right now we have 205 million people across 45 countries experience a food crisis or worse, phase 3 out of 5 phases in 2022. That is really serious. And we see also it's going up from 175 to 205. But it should be 0, let's be very clear. But we see the number of countries also in this study stable, but it doesn't mean that there are not more countries with these problems. But here you see also conflict on the right side of my slide, and I hope you can see it. Let me check. You can see basically from 2018 to 2021, what was basically the main source, main reason for conflict, for food insecurity. Conflict is the biggest one, by far. This year, 139, or 2021, 139 million in 24 countries. And then weather extremes, 23 million, and economic shocks, 30 million. So we have to realize that conflicts are very often the reason for food insecurity, but the other way around, food insecurity may also lead to big conflicts. So they are very often interlinked. But it's important to understand, if you want to solve the problem, then especially proactively, then you have to know what's happening in there. Then another slide with data. So we thought for a long time that basically the prevalence of the number of undernourished people was going down. The number went down to about 600, but it went up again very quickly because of COVID, and now also because of other crises as well in the regions. And I really like the data in the picture here on the right. And I hope that you can see my pointer. No, so I'll just explain it. You see, since 2012, the number of people forcibly displaced worldwide has gone up from about 40 to 100 million. And the green parts of the diagram are basically internally displaced people. That surprised me. So I knew from Ethiopia and from other countries where we work and where I have been myself, but most of the people are displaced within the country. We always see the problems of displacement across continents, but you see, and asylum seekers is the yellow one. That's a very small thing. And when you're in Europe, you hear all the time about asylum seekers. It's a very small number. And we have to make sure, I think, as CGIAR, we have a mission also to support those people who need us the most. And how do climate and conflict impact food security? In the first place, what about the quality of the modeling? We hear sometimes those stories. 30 years ago, I was working at IRI, the Rice Institute, together with 14 teams on modeling rice production in Asia. And we looked at what would be the effect of climate change. 1993. We published a book, but the models that indicated climate change are indicating effects that are not as bad as they are right now. So these foresighting models are super important, and we have to think and take them seriously. So climate shocks and conflicts, both local and international, disrupt trade. And we've seen now with the Ukraine war what happens. 1 one country a problem, world trade, many disasters even. Wheat prices went up in a week's time, tremendously. Climate shocks and conflicts destroy productive assets. I don't have to explain what happens. Look at Ukraine, but also look in other countries where conflicts play a role. And they displace people. So many things globally going on. So we need solutions. And we need evidence-based and science-based solutions. So climate and conflict disrupt supply, demand and trade, three key elements of the food system. Now, local shocks are globally linked and can lead to humanitarian crises, food riots and stock market losses. 5 years ago, we did a study in my team with Lloyd's of London. What would it mean if 3 small crises happened at the same time in the food system? That was basically, in those days, UG99, a new pathogen, breaks out in Iran. At the same time, there's an El Nino giving water shortage, water problems in Australia and the United States. Such type of small things that happen all the time together can already cause basically riots, humanitarian crises and stock market losses. So food prices quickly could go up 4 times. Now we've seen now also with the Ukraine war and COVID what can happen. Then some evidence, because also we have to see how are they linked? What is the cause and what is the following result? And in this picture you see a study that has been done in the Sahelian zone, very fragile, we all know it, and looking at hotspots. So basically the top hotspots, red side is basically extreme violent events, and the blue one is big variability in precipitation, in rainfall. We see that we get more drought periods and then extreme rainfall that is of course then very often not very useful. So the hotspots indicate where we have those problems, and so then you can basically starting look what are the reasons, what is really happening there and how can we solve those problems. So our scientists studying these type of things, we are hopefully also in the future working together with people looking at solutions. Then Kenya, very complicated, and many of our scientists are working in Kenya. So we see that basically on the left side you see the distribution of rainfall, on the right side you see the distribution of serious conflict. And of course on the right side you see also where the pastoralists move from the west to the east when they come in a drought period. And the farmers there also need to make sure that their feed is given to their animals, and then you get conflicts. Of course, you would say, but how can we avoid it? Can we design policies, better technologies to solve those problems? And then Central America. Here, the darker, the bigger the hotspot of problems. Problems getting together of household level increased problems, food levels, food security, poverty and inequality. And you see that there's major dark spots, and that's what we all see when all these people try to flee through Mexico, where I lived myself for 6 years, to the north. So conflicts all over the world, all over the place coming together. And then also some data that show that we are improving. For example, here in Ethiopia, in the north of Ethiopia, the Amhara region, where we see that because there is now a peace being signed, that the baseline food insecurity is going down, but still, it's still at 70%. Can you believe it? But what was also important, on the right side of the slide, you see our scientists did surveys to see what are the key issues farmers are worried about. And that's super important. Of course, increasing food prices, violence, unemployment are important. But here, for example, you see that weeds are also still very high on the list. They're always, so we don't have certain things about weeds, but so there's many of these causes, but violence is a very important one, affecting 75% of the households, and half of the households were affected by unemployment. As CGIAR in Ethiopia, we even had to get our scientists out of the region because it was too dangerous. Now, climate conflict, the food system, what are the key messages? First, the evidence for the relationship between climate variability and conflict exists across multiple different contexts. So we all know it, but we have now more detailed data. But I want to know more, what are the reasons, and then can we solve it? The relationship between climate and conflict is not linear or direct. It is mediated very often through intermediate variables, including those related to food systems, food and nutritional security and employment. And the third one, conflict and climate change can drive hunger, while hunger and climate change can contribute again to the emergence of conflict. And understanding that is crucial. So functioning food systems and food security are critical components between climate change, human insecurity and conflict. And then a quote, and this is an old version of the slide, from the president of the African Farmers Organization, Elizabeth. I met her last week. I hope she's also here at the conference. Super leader and super important to listen to her, also what farmers think. And the last sentence here is a quote to what she said last week on stage in a ministerial meeting. Food systems are a crucial area where investments in R&D and transformation can contribute to stabilization in the short term and in the climate resilient peace in the long term. She thinks that agri-food systems should be a source for investment and a reason to invest. Like what Akin Adesina says all the time, agriculture is basically a business. So a key part of the solution, I'm leading the Resilient Agri-Food System Science area in the CGIAR, and I always summarize it in one sentence what we have to do. Contribute with research and investment to agri-food systems transformation for affordable, sufficient and healthy diets produced within planetary boundaries in a climate crisis. Just one sentence, but I think it covers it all, and it covers the major challenge that we have to work on, building resilient food systems, because I think also with the global problems like with the Ukraine war and the wheat crisis, the wheat prices, etc., building regional resilient production systems is crucial for me. And that's what we try to support in that sense. And we don't need silver bullet solutions. They have to come from all the three areas. Better genetics, better seeds. For example, drought-tolerant maize or resilient varieties. Management, better soil fertility solutions. And governance and policy. I think those three have to come together, and in the CG, we are bringing them together, because that's the only way that we can have innovation at scale. Thank you very much. And my last slide is a promotion of the project of the CGIAR Focus Climate Security. They are making now dashboards and a climate security observatory. And all the participants here maybe can have a look at the CGIAR website, because I think it's exciting that we get the information and data together. And thanks. Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. I think his presentation provided enough evidence for us. And of course, there is no lack of data, but it's just the lack of will to translate these into actions. And if I may also add to the last slide that you mentioned, the second last slide on the innovations, if there is no peace, none of the innovations will work. This is the experience that we, citizens of countries that are affected by conflict, are facing. So the interlinkages are clear. Now with that, I would like to open the panel discussion, which will be followed by some interventions from the floor and then the question and answer sessions. Today in the panel we have His Excellency Mr. Oleksiy Kozmenkov, Ukraine Head of the State Water Agency, Ministry of Environmental Protection and Natural Resources of Ukraine. Ms. Susan Gardner, Director of Ecosystem Division of UN Environmental Program. And Mr. Wadid Aryan, Advisor for the Sustainable Development League of the Arab States. Ms. Pauline Madero, Kenya Charter for Change Secretariat Coordinator, Youth and Civil Society Representatives. and Mr. Jon Fernandez de Loreno, team leader of FAO's Indigenous Peoples team. And I would like to pose the first question to Mr. Oleksiy Kozmenkov. Your Excellency, Ukraine, like the rest of the Europe, is facing and is dealing with the effect of climate change. On the top of that, staple food can neither not be produced or cannot leave the country because of the war that Ukraine is facing. This in turn has led to the global food crisis, given Ukraine's position as a global exporter of the staple food. How do you make sense of the multitude of challenges facing Ukraine today? And if you would also like to ask you, what will be the solution that you would like to propose as a citizen of the country and delegation of the country that is facing war and that is also affecting the food system in the rest of the world? The floor is yours, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much. Доброго дня, шановні присутні.
Good day, everybody.
Перш за все, хотів би подякувати за можливість взяти участь у сьогоднішній події і представляти державу Україна сьогодні.
I would like to thank everybody for the possibility to represent Ukraine right now and speak about it.
Відповідаючи на ваше запитання, я все ж таки почну з того, що найбільшою проблемою, з якою зіткнулася сьогодні моя держава, це є та варварська війна, жахлива варварська війна, яку принесла на нашу землю держава Російська Федерація.
Answering your first question, the main problem right now is in Ukraine is Russian war, the terrible war which was began by Russia, and now we are facing its consequences.
Тому, подолавши саме цю перепону, я впевнений, що це буде найбільшим вкладом в забезпечення продовольчої безпеки.
And only after winning in this war we can continue and go on and work on our program.
Ми з оптимізмом дивимося у майбутнє, і сьогодні ми впевнені, що найближчим часом після отримання перемоги у цій війні ми зможемо знов повернутися до відновлення нашої країни.
We are looking with hope to our future, and especially after the victory of Ukraine in last 2 days, after we took back the Kherson regional city, we are sure that we can do it.
Сьогодні урядом держави Україна підготовлений план відновлення держави, і в якому ключове місце займає саме розвиток аграрного сектору.
Today we have a plan for development of Ukraine where the main sector is agriculture.
Україна у довоєнний час постійно входила у п'ятірку світових лідерів за виробництвом та експорту зернових та олійних культур.
Ukraine before war was one of the main exporters of sunflower oil and of grain as well.
Але в Україні ще сьогодні є дуже значний потенціал щодо збільшення виробництва і експорту.
But in Ukraine there is much more potential for producing and export.
Перш за все, цього можна досягти за рахунок розвитку зрошення в Україні.
First of all, we can reach it.
Досягти за рахунок відновлення зрошення в Україні.
First of all, we should reach the renovation of aggregation of territories of Ukraine.
У довоєнний час в Україні зрошувалось приблизно 550 тисяч гектарів землі, що дорівнює приблизно 20% від наявних зрошувальних земель.
In Ukraine before war, the land which was aggregated is around 550,000 of square meters, which was around 20% of land in Ukraine in general.
Тобто та інфраструктура, яка була побудована ще з радянських часів, вона здатна забезпечити полив на площі більше ніж 2 мільйони гектар.
So the infrastructure which was built during Soviet times is still capable of aggregation of 2 million hectares.
Але сьогодні, на жаль, Два найбільших магістральних зрошувальних каналів знаходяться на окупованих територіях Російської Федерації.
But today, unfortunately, the main two channels of aggregation canals are under Russian occupation.
До війни ми встигли розробити досить прогресивне законодавство, яке стосується зрошення в Україні.
Before war, we managed to do quite progressive laws about aggregation in Ukraine.
Це і стратегія зрошення та дренажу в Україні, і закон про організацію водокористувачів.
This is a strategy of aggregation and delarge in Ukraine.
Тому ми маємо значний потенціал, і зараз ми маємо вже всі політичні, адміністративні і юридичні підстави і умови законодавчі для залучення інвестицій у розвиток зрошення.
And today we have the main and biggest potential for implementing and also introducing new investments in Ukraine for aggregation of our lands.
Тому, подолавши перш за все нашу найбільшу зараз боль, це закінчивши цю війну і повернувши наші окуповані території, Україна може взяти на себе значні додаткові зобов'язання щодо збільшення і експорту агропромислової продукції.
And only after we take our territories back and the war is stopped, we can produce and continue exporting and producing and being the main exporter of grain and etc. And it can happen only after our victory in this war.
Thank you, Your Excellency. The war must stop, and this is our collective will and our wish. And it's heartening to hear the suffering of people of Ukraine. And we feel that. We, the citizens of countries that have faced similar wars, feel them. Now I would like to go to Ms. Susan Gardner, the Director of Ecosystem of UNEP. Climate change affects food production and availability, access, quality, utilization, and stability of food system. And as you heard, food insecurity and conflict are highly correlated. What can be the solution for the vulnerable countries that are the least contributor to the climate change, but are the worst impacted by the climate change? The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this important conversation. The extraordinary presentations that we've heard so far have laid out very clearly the case for how climate change amplifies migration, environmental degradation, and intensifies competition for natural resources, which we know will turn into conflicts in countries where indigenous peoples, local communities are often the most vulnerable. Environmental change and the associated spread of pests and diseases also contribute to this vicious cycle of poverty and hunger, particularly when it's exacerbated by fragile institutions or conflicts, violence, and displacement. Just as we're speaking now, more than 2,500 conflicts over food and natural resources are currently occurring globally, and each of these will have ripple effects. But we can't let these crises derail international efforts to increase adaptation. We need unprecedented will and far more long-term investment in adaptation to stop the adaptation gap from widening. So in terms of solutions, effective adaptation and risk reduction solutions and technologies should be drivers to curb growing risk and foster system-wide changes to agriculture and food systems. So there's a couple solutions in particular that I want to highlight. One is about comprehensive risk management approaches that can reduce the risk and mitigate the destructive impacts, helping to understand and predict disasters and climate change, particularly on food systems. And we've seen that early warning systems can provide climate forecasts as one of the most cost-effective solutions for building climate resilience, especially among the agricultural sector, where these early warnings can help farmers to plan and to adapt their planning schedule and save lives so often. The other thing is about, again, scaling up ecosystem-based adaptation, and we know this is a win-win strategy to protect communities from climate impacts and reduce disaster risk, while simultaneously providing so many other benefits like food security and clean water. At UNEP, we've been assisting over 50 countries through 70 climate change adaptation projects to cover a range of ecosystem-based adaptation options, as well as supporting national adaptation plans to help promote climate resilient practices. For example, in Gambia and Rwanda, we have ecosystem-based adaptation approaches like improving the seed varieties, adjusting irrigation and drainage practices, and applying soil and water conservation approaches that help reduce both the impacts of climate change and unsustainable agricultural practices at the same time. So this can all enhance food production, but can also enhance biodiversity and have a whole range of co-benefits. Globally, climate finance must address the multiple crises of food, water, and energy systems and the underlying drivers of environmental change that fuel conflicts in crisis-affected contexts. National governments can contribute by shifting away from environmentally harmful subsidies, investing in low-carbon and nature-friendly solutions and technology, and systematically internalizing environmental and social costs in their accounting and their development planning. And there's a lot of new financing innovations that can be solutions for agriculture and go a long way in addressing these links between climate, conflict, food, and biodiversity crises. In terms of what's needed to better coordinate, we need to work harder to promote climate adaptation and restore ecosystems in crisis-affected contexts, and we can do this by jointly working across different disciplines. We know that work to protect the environment is more difficult in conflict areas and fragile contexts. We know that, of course. And working to protect the environment and help societies adapt to climate change is more important in the context in which the state lacks inclusive institutions, especially in conflict contexts where societies can be trapped in these cycles of environmental degradation, exploitation, and then unmanaged natural resources, and disputes over those can trigger further violence, and we know that this is a vicious cycle. So in recognition of the need to work harder in conflict-affected contexts, UNEP is intensifying our work in the UN peace and security architecture in conflict-affected countries. I would say in conclusion, climate change adaptation can contribute to peace building and vice versa. COP27 must become the forum to scale up adaptation finance and efforts in fragile and vulnerable countries, and to target agriculture and food systems, water, and biodiversity. Climate change adaptation can be entry points to build peace and resolve conflict, and it's an opportunity to tackle both simultaneously. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The early warning, the coordination are the most interesting parts that I would like to wish to come at the end, that how it works. We have been, at least as we remember on the early warning, we have wake-up calls and wake-up calls after one another, but we take it for granted that we do not move in the right direction. But thank you so much for your insights. And now I would like to move to Mr. Wadid Aryan. As you know, the Middle East, many countries are facing hunger and drought due to climate change, and at the same time wars. That has dramatically increased the humanitarian situation. What do you make out of these interlinkages that work in the region? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. First of all, I would like to tell you that League of Arab States member states are 22. And they are, most of them in Africa and Asia. Out of the 22 countries, we have 8 countries affected by conflicts, beside 1 country under occupation, Palestine. And let me tell you that each 2 out of 5 people in our region are subject for conflict affected. And that means we are talking about almost 1,080,000 inhabitants. They are affected by conflicts. And at the same time, let me tell you, UNDP just published report 22 telling that for each capita, $2 are the share for in countries affected by conflicts, and $10 for countries in fragile situation, and $160 for countries which has stability. That means there is no fair in all the game, and who's suffering should continue suffering, and now we have to look to the subject that way. So that was a challenge in front of us in the League of Arab States, and for that reason we started with our partners to write a report with Human Security Unit in New York, with IOM, with ESCOA, with others, just to study what exactly is the situation in our region, and especially if we are talking about implementation of SDGs. So we came with a conclusion that we need to act, and while acting, we have to put in our minds that no one to be left behind. Meaning, multi-stakeholders is very important. All of them should be involved in the process. We should look to the process from the different angles. So it has environmental component besides socioeconomic components as well. So the report recommendation came with the triple nexus approach, highlighting triple nexus approach, where we have to have peace building beside development and the humanitarian to be studied. So we formed immediately a committee, and this committee is working as a multi-stakeholder committee, including the member states beside main organizations and as well as civil society and the private sector as well. So the idea now is how to move forward with this. So we selected from each country what we call a national committee for sustainable development, which is already in the national and subnational level acting. And we are working with them, with the other member stakeholders, to establish a program. Now, beside what we are doing on that one, we have another committee dealing with end of hunger. And this is the other side of the problem. I mean, the food crisis we have is leading us to act on that direction. And this is again another side of the activities which we are doing. We have a conflict component within the program of ending hunger in Arab region, especially with the number of refugees we have and the internal refugees within the countries as well, with a huge displacement. So we are working as well with a new initiative. We just today had a meeting with our colleagues, our alliance, who are IFIs, and the MDPs, and also the different donors. The idea is to solve the second point, investment, and also funding a program for sustainability solution for human security. Sustainable solutions for human security includes different programs that's working together as a package, and within this package we are dealing with first better modernizing our understanding for climate change, because sometimes take decisions without understanding how the climate change is impacting our communities, looking to the risk and what type of risks we have to deal with, looking inside why we have already some hot issues in the community related to the demographic reason, for instance, demographic shape of the youth in our region, the women, and also looking to the implementation of SDGs, why we can't, in many countries, implement the SDGs by 2030. The first part of this includes the triple nexus. And the triple nexus, we are focusing on the triple nexus because, as I mentioned, the number we are facing instability is high. And this could be for all the globe a good approach that to be followed, because in all the globe we will never find such number, and also number of countries as well, and number of people affected. And the way we are dealing with this includes the different groups who are Alliance for Development. So those are the angles that we are working through.
So I just would like to interrupt you here, because there was, in the presentation, Martin mentioned about the regional resilience. If you could briefly, very briefly tell me how the triple nexus would work in Yemen, for example. You know, one of the countries that is facing, you know, compounding impacts of both climate change and also war.
Yeah,
and given the regional dynamics there.
We already inside Yemen, and we have started acting in Yemen. We have 2 projects in Yemen, and one of the projects it's about renewable energy, and the other project about clean water. So with those 2 examples, we are working with UNDP and other partners, especially in what we call SDG Climate Facility, and under the umbrella of the League of Arab States. And we managed till now to bring success stories. Let me tell you, because of the crisis and the conflicts, majority of Yemen people went to renewable energy. 70% of the energy produced now in Yemen is renewable. So this is by itself something we have to recognize and to read it from the stories So building a conversation internally and working with multi-stakeholders, and this is in our report for conflicts and SDGs, you will find this. So this is the way we can solve the problems, and this is the way we have to act. It's exactly, let me give you this example, and this is I'm going to end with. If you would like to build a pyramid, you need a very strong and healthy stones. And this is exactly what the Pharaoh has done from the beginning, 50 centuries ago. And the only way to do this now is to work and consider that each of the local communities is a stone. We have to bring better resilience, and we have to bring the healthy communities, and we have to build the pyramids in a better shape. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yes, each of the communities is the hedge. And with that, I would like to turn to Ms. Pauline, who is closely working with communities and civil society organizations who are the most extensively affected by interlinked threats of climate change, food insecurity, and conflict. So how is climate change exacerbating the existing social, political, and economic dynamics and tensions and the pre-existence vulnerability? And what do you see as the solutions needed to amplify resilience of communities that are at risk? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to represent the Horn of Africa and also the civil society organization. And just to mention that also to present the voice of the local communities. So according to the UNICEF's report in August 23, 2022, they said that over 20 million people, including 10 million in Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia, will need food assistance through 2022. So I draw an example from Kenya. Majorly, we depend on agriculture and pastoralism. And when these climate shocks come, you realize that many problems set in. For example, you'd see we have displaced communities. People migrate to go and look for resources elsewhere. And where they move to, the resources are already, they are little. So you find that conflict arise because people start fighting for the few resources that are there. We have a problem with the schooling. Children start dropping out of school because now they really need to go to long distance places to look for water. And here we are talking about a situation whereby they are not even sure if this water is clean, and they go on just taking it. So when they take this dirty water, they are prone to diseases, you know. So the situation is not solved at that time. So this also brings about an issue of the family conflicts, whereby you get that the fathers now leave the households and the mothers are stressed to take care of the young ones. And this also contributes to the mental issue, because a stressed mother will not take care of a family household. And again, if this mother is breastfeeding, then that means it impacts on the nutrition status of this child. So the young people also decide to join radicalized groups like, for example, the Al-Shabaab, because they are trying to look for a way and a means of income due to these climate stressors. And probably they psychologically they had not even prepared that probably they will lose their jobs or their sources of income. So I would categorically say that this issue is really affecting us so much. Currently, we are grappling with ways and strategies to work through the drought that we are going through. And as you had also mentioned just in your introduction, Somalia is facing a major drought in 40 years. And again, to mention, as we are talking about the drought, in some parts of the African countries, they are also experiencing floods. So we have this unequal rainfall patterns also within Kenya, and some parts will face the floods, some will also face the drought. So when we look at our communities, you know, they are the first responders of these issues. So some of the solutions that I would give just to build on the resilience of our communities, we are saying first, is it possible or create more spaces for women leaders to meaningfully participate in decision-making spaces? Because when these issues come in, as women, we are very affected. Our girls, you know, they have the fear of protection, and we are saying that sometimes they are exploited during this kind of disasters, climate-related disasters. Number two, please invest in invest in the local financing. We need to build our local capacities, and as we channel our money through the existing structures in our government, it is important to reach the local organizations. Number three, involve us, the youth, in decision-making spaces, because we have good ideas. We can always build on these ideas, and we are also the future policy makers. Another one is always generate an understanding among the community members on the importance of peace, resilience, and food security, and also development, because some of the organizations, they bring development programs to our communities. But when the members do not understand this connection, sometimes these programs do not benefit them. And when we have these wars in our community, sometimes you bring a very good program. For example, you dig a borehole in the community area. But when they have all these conflicts among them, they leave and they will not benefit from it. So continuously do that. And this you can also do by providing platforms for them so that they are able to be trained on issues of non-confrontational advocacy and all that. So another thing I would say is during our implementation in the programs that we have, always enhance the collaboration of resilience-focused interventions at the community level. And this could be livelihoods related, and also in terms of dietary diversification, so that we build a community that is food resilient. But when we talk about dietary diversification, put it back in your mind that you need to tell the community members to explore the use of the locally available foods in their communities. And also when you talk about diversified livelihoods, be very sensitive to their culture, because when I say that in Kenya we have pastoralists, and when you tell them to change this culture and probably explore maybe beekeeping, it might not be very friendly, but use some negotiation skills and show them the importance of having that. I call on our leaders also to work on joint strategies just to take care of our environment. You realize that in parts of Africa, Country A has banned the use of plastic bags, but when you go to country B, you get that they are still using those bags, you know. Sometimes it actually really shocks me. I've not been seeing this in a long time, but when I travel, I see it in another country. So it's important to come together and work towards having joint strategies as countries. Yeah. So those are some of the recommendations I would give in terms of building resilient communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pauline, for brilliant remarks. And if I could pick one word or one principle, that is the country ownership. Is a principle that the international community has, committed to. And when we launched the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States by G7 Plus and donor and civil society, that was one of the overarching principle. So thank you so much. And also you raise a very important point of cultural sensitivity, which is often lacking in the policies that are made to address humanitarian development needs. And with that, I would like to now turn to Mr. Jon Fernandez de Lareño. I hope I am pronouncing your name correctly. Indigenous peoples' food system were identified as a game-changing solution for the sustainability of at 2021 UN Food System Summit. And FAO hosts the secretariat of the two important bodies, the Global Hub for Indigenous Peoples Food System and the Coalition on Indigenous Peoples Food System. Now, why and how climate change and conflict are threatening indigenous peoples' food system? And could you also please elaborate on why indigenous peoples' food and knowledge system are key to climate action, biodiversity conservation, and food system transformation? The floor is yours, Mr. Long.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the use of the word. And congratulations to all the eminent panelists. I think a lot has been said, and what I'm going to be presenting in relation to the work that FAO is doing on indigenous people's food systems is somehow connected to many of the points that have been already introduced by the colleagues. I don't know if how I can get the presentation on the screen, colleagues. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the game-changing nature of indigenous people's food systems. Now, I think we are all here because obviously things are not working well, and they are not working well for the climate, but they are also not working well for food security. And I think Professor Martin Croft presented some of the data of food insecurity from the SOFI this year, and we have seen that the number of food insecure over the past 5 years has increased across the world, but so has the number of conflicts. There's more than 30 ongoing conflicts and wars in the planet, and at the same time what we are seeing is that the current food systems are really part of the problem. They emit greenhouse gases. They are a tremendous contributor for the ongoing deforestation in the planet, and they are one of the main users of water, just to mention some of the statistics. But what is really unacceptable for all of us is that we are throwing to the waste, we are throwing to the garbage 1/3 of the food that we are producing. So there's enough food in the planet for all of us, but there is millions of people that go to bed hungry, and at the same time we are throwing in our homes, in our supermarkets, in our restaurants, incredible amounts of money. Now what's going on? Where is the money going? Is money going in the right direction? Well, the big yellow dot is the amount of resources that are going to weapons and war and conflict and killing. And you see the amount of official development aid, that is about 30 billion. And that small tiny dot is the one that represents the international efforts on disarmament and non-proliferation organizations. The one in the middle is the budget for the UN. So are we going in the right direction? Are we doing the right thing? Where are we putting the money? Are we putting the money where our heart is? FAO is leading 3 initiatives in relation to indigenous people's food systems, and we are doing that with countries, with member countries. We are doing that with universities, with research centers. The main one is the Global Hub on Indigenous People's Food Systems. I'll be talking about that in a minute. But we launched a coalition, and we did so not long ago, thanks to the ongoing discussions that we have with a group of friends of indigenous peoples, where 36 countries, many from Africa, come together to see how we can learn about the indigenous peoples. This is the launching of the coalition. We did it 2 weeks ago. We wanted to do it on an indigenous territories. You have several ambassadors there, several indigenous leaders, and we did that by creating an indigenous territory in the heart of Rome. We brought a nomadic tent because we didn't want to launch a coalition anywhere. We thought we shouldn't do it in an office with ties. We wanted to do it in creating an indigenous territory, so we brought an indigenous tent, we placed an indigenous altar, and we had indigenous leading the launching of their coalition on indigenous people's food systems. These are the 20 institutions that come together to work collectively on indigenous people's food systems. We believe that as FAO we don't know enough, and we realize when we talk to universities, when we talk to other institutions, that they don't know enough. So we are partnering all together, and the key work is collective co-creation of knowledge that we are doing with indigenous women and men at the center. But what is interesting is that when we approached the UN Food Systems Committee, we told them how could the Global Hub contribute. And one of the things was to transform oral knowledge and oral indigenous people's knowledge in a written form so scientists could incorporate it in the discussions of the UN Food Systems Summit. We produced collectively the White Wipala paper with more than 60 authors, more than 36 indigenous and non-indigenous organizations, and the Wipala paper was accepted as one of the reference documents on indigenous people's food systems for the UN Food Systems Summit by the scientific committee. But the other thing that was very important for all of us is that for the first time, scientists recognize that indigenous people's food systems are game changers on sustainability and resilience. This was new for scientists. It was not new for indigenous peoples. They've been telling us this for several years, and perhaps we have not been listening. And why are indigenous people's food systems so important? Because in the current context, we are all talking about agriculture, but if we look back in time, indigenous people's food systems had been feeding humanity and had been feeding the communities for thousands of years, long before even agriculture started, and much long before the Green Revolution started producing food, the way that we are interpreting food production these days. Now, when you talked about indigenous people's food systems, there's a number of characteristics that make them very important in the context of the climate crisis that we are describing in the context of conflict. You see the circularity with which indigenous peoples represent their food systems. And there are key elements. The main one is biocentrism. They give tremendous importance to biocentric approaches and to the importance of nature resisting independently of the use that humankind does of it. But the other one is they are very interested in solidarity and reciprocity. They practice it to these days within their communities. And when we talked about nutrition, we need to talk about diversifying our diets and expanding the food base. Indigenous peoples consume tremendous amount of foods that they don't make it to the markets. What is very interesting is that they are the most important domesticators of wild varieties to this day. They keep domesticating varieties. Our food systems relied in 3 main crops for more than 50% of the kilocalories that we consume. This is a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for more crisis. It's a recipe for an over-reliance on crops that are likely to fail in the current context of climate change. Let me move on. We identified in this important publication 39 drivers affecting the continuity of indigenous people's food systems. Of course, conflict is one of them, but so is the pressure, from external actors, mining, deforestation. Something very interesting is that the preservation and the conservation efforts are displacing indigenous people, so it's also a driver that affects indigenous people's food and knowledge systems. And something that we need to understand is that we need to blend indigenous people's food systems with innovation. And we need to do that by changing the hierarchies of knowledge that we consider when we draft policies. Very often we do not include orality, and we are mixing a big part of the picture. So my take-home messages are very simple. The first one is that indigenous people's food and knowledge systems are game changers for sustainability and resilience. And unless we learn from them, it's very likely that some of their systems will disappear before we actually had the opportunity of grasping the knowledge and wisdom they have. The other one is that they are very threatened by conflict, global crisis, and by the increasing of external pressures, mining, deforestation. But again, I want to insist on well-intended conservation efforts that are displacing millions of indigenous peoples across the world. Their food and knowledge systems present innovative solutions for all of us. It's just a matter of sitting down around the fireplace and learning from them. So it's about our arrogance. It's about our own scientific approaches to looking at things. But they are willing to share their knowledge with us if we are willing to listen. And indigenous people's food systems are disappearing at an incredible rate. And if we don't do something about it, it will be too late for all of us. Indigenous youth, and our sisters from Kenya already put it on the table, indigenous youth are at the center. They are the present and future of indigenous people's food systems, and so are indigenous women. So with this, I want to thank you for the use of the word, and back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Fernandez. Your presentation provided a very good insight as the last panelist. And also, what I could get is that we need to introduce some humility or humbleness in the international system. And that calls for inclusivity and listening to the isolated people in this planet. So thank you so much for your great remarks. With that, it's unfortunate that the time is very short, so we might skip the Q&A, which I'm sure you would have a lot of questions, but I would like to invite you all to talk to the speakers after the event. I would like to have to call Ms. Champa Patel, Chief of Innovation and Deputy Director for Future of Conflict for the International Crisis Group, to provide some reflection from the floor. Ms. Patel, you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to be very brief, so maybe there might be time for some questions. But I just had 4 observations that I wanted to share. The first is, many people have spoken already today about reaffirming the importance of an evidence-based approach. Some of the compound shocks that we've talked about are global, but they play out very differently at local levels. And we need to understand these specificities in order to ensure appropriate solutions are identified. For example, our recent work on South Sudan has assessed how 4 consecutive years of historic flooding have exacerbated food and livelihood insecurity. Rising waters have seen pastoralists flee in south, where their presence has increased tensions with host communities, leading to violence in the Equatoria region. And our evidence base has to better understand the disruptive role the non-state actors play. So we have forthcoming research on Al-Shabaab in Somalia, which assesses not only how they are impacted by climate change, but also how they're instrumentalizing these shocks to pursue their own agendas and cement their control over vulnerable populations. And this goes beyond classic conflict contexts. We are also doing some work looking at criminal organized groups in Mexico, so looking at the cartels, and analyzing how they're using their local domination to respond very quickly to climate shocks and presenting themselves as first responders. Secondly, investing in food systems in conflict contexts is essential, but it isn't enough by itself, and we shouldn't pretend that it is. I think it's been mentioned already that political will is critical, whether that's at local, regional, or international levels, to resolve conflicts. But geopolitics and geoeconomics pose challenges that we tend to minimize or overlook in conversations like these, perhaps because they can seem insurmountable. But we have to navigate our way through that and push for conflict resolution, whether it's through middle and swing powers playing a bigger role or through other means, because without peace, there are no sustainable solutions, and peace is more often than not a political process. And at the same time, thirdly, there are opportunities. The global food system is far too reliant on too few countries for the bulk of its food stock, leaving the world vulnerable to climate and commodity shocks. So there are opportunities here to accelerate food systems transformation, but this also requires political will and adequate financing, including, as others have said, at local level. And finally, all of this requires greater international cooperation. Food insecurity and climate change are global concerns, and both demand a global response. But in doing so, we have to ensure the inclusion of conflict-affected populations, as others have said, whether that's women, indigenous groups, youth, because ultimately any sustainable solutions have to be locally rooted and locally owned. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Ms. Patel. Yes, really tremendous remarks. And unfortunately, we don't have time for the Q&A session. As much as I would like this conversation to be free flow, but we are limited by the time. And with that, we have come to the closing of the session. And in the conclusion, I would like to invite Mr. Martin Frick, Director of the World Food Program Berlin Global Office, Deputy to the Special Envoy for the UN Food System Summit 2021. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. That was a long and rich session, and I don't want to hold you for too long. But I want to give you three numbers. 3 years ago, the number of acutely hunger people, the people that the World Food Program has to look after, was 135 million people. COVID had it that this number exploded, and last December, we were at 276 million people being food insecure. And that was before a single shot was fired in Ukraine. Today, this number is 345 million. If we ask ourselves why so many people are going hungry when actually the world is committed to abolish hunger by 2030, there are 3 C's. It's conflict, it's COVID, and it's climate change. Now, conflict. We have double as many conflicts in the world than 10 years ago. And of course, we hope for diplomatic initiatives. COVID, we hope that COVID is over, but if we look back to the last pandemics, they were all related to food systems. And climate change in an uncertain world is actually today the thing that we know best. Now, we are not even surprised anymore if every year is the hottest year on record. And it is so obvious that this is impacting on our food security. But just when I walked into this room, the new numbers came in, and this year is again the highest emission year in the history of mankind. This is crazy. We will not fix the global food crisis until we get the climate crisis under control. So the first and foremost thing to say is the most elementary need is to have something to eat. The bread price was always political. Here in ancient Egypt, in the old empires, they collapsed when food was not available. So our imperative is firstly, mitigation. We need to stop emitting. This is the root cause of everything. But this is the COP for adaptation and for resilience and for loss and damage, and rightly so, because we can't leave people alone where they need our help the most. And if I'm telling you that in most fragile contexts, compared to non-fragile contexts, people only receive the 80th part of adaptation money, it's obviously that this is not working. It's a moral imperative to help people in fragile situations. It's also a hard security imperative, because you will never get peace and stability in regions if you don't stop this vicious cycle. So I hope that this COP, which is on the African continent, which is an adaptation COP, manages to get money into the most fragile situations so we can slowly help to rebuild what has been destroyed, and we keep up our belief in the Sustainable Development Goals, and we don't lose sight of the really most noble goal to abolish hunger by 2030. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Martin. And you did a very good job of concluding this session. And of course, it would be extremely difficult to conclude such a rich conversation. But I also would like to leave you with the hope that the COP27 negotiation considers these questions that we discussed today. Thank you so much. This event is closed now.
Kenya, beyond the main electricity grid, the sun is fusing with
plays a critical role in economic development in Kenya.
The sun, one of nature's gifts to Africa, is abundant. In Kenya, beyond the main electricity grid, the sun is fusing with technology to power smallholder businesses and agriculture.
Solar powered technologies plays a critical role in economic development in Kenya, especially in the agricultural sector and also
Hello. احمد ناولني حجرين والنبي من دول. Hello. Yes. Hello. Hello.